Do you beat the field? What I've just told you might not make any sense to you. That's because I just translated an idiom from Romanian directly into English, word for word. If you haven't read the title already, in this video I will talk about why translations matter and why picking the wrong translation will hurt your experience when reading. I will also give you some advice on how you can decide on the best translation for you. However, one of these solutions will only apply to you if you speak two languages. I've got another solution for you in case you only speak one language, which I will tell you closer to the end of this video. The problem is that ideas are only yours. Only you truly know what you wanted to say. That really isn't that big of an issue if the target audience speaks the same language as you. However, there arises a big problem if they don't. The solution to that problem relies on translations. The problem is that translations are flawed. When you're translating a book, it is very important to know the ideas conveyed very well, because if you don't, then you will end up with a shallow text and a work that is devoid of any meaning and is very incoherent. This type of translation is called mot a mot or word for word, where you disregard any sort of language differences and you translate directly from the original language into the translated language. For example, let's take the Romanian idiom abate câmpii. If you would be to translate that directly into English, it would be translated as to beat the fields, which doesn't really make any sense if you do not speak Romanian already. In order to translate that well, you would have to know what abate câmpii means, which basically means empty talk. So if you want to actually translate this properly, you would have to go with either empty talk or use a similar idiom, so that it would translate as beat around the bush. This would be an actual correct translation and the proper way to do it. The second issue which arises is word order. Different languages of course have different word orders, which is a huge problem when translating because you have to take account and keep account of these things. Let's take for example a quote by Cato the Elder on the Punic Wars. Carthago delenda est. The phrase what I just told you, if you would be to translate it word for word, would mean Carthage destroyed is. However, that doesn't really sound right. The thing is, in Latin, this kind of phrase formation implies that there is an order, something that must be done. Therefore, properly translating it would be Carthage destroyed must be, which still sounds a bit odd. So let's apply the English word order and we would get Carthage must be destroyed. Carthago delenda est. This is actually right now. The original translation that I just told you wouldn't really have been that wrong and you would get the understanding of the sentence. However, it doesn't really pack the same power that the one in Latin does. So that's why an important part of translation is getting the meaning done right. Because if you don't, you will lose some of the meaning found in the original message. Picking the right translation is in fact a challenging endeavor, because different translators have different approaches to how they would go about translating a work. For example, some people might approach a more literal translation, where they translate word for word, which is only good if you already know the ins and outs of the original language, which at that point, why would you even read the translated version? You should just read the original version. The second option is paraphrasing, where you would not go word for word, but rather you would go meaning for meaning. So instead of translating a text mot a mot, you would translate basically the ideas. You would keep the ideas the same but reshape the phrases so that they actually make sense in the language. The thing is that this kind of translation is very hard to achieve, as you need to both know the native language and the language you're translating into very well, and you also need to know the ideas conveyed in the book very well, because otherwise how else would you get the ideas? If you fall short of any of these two skills, you will make a shit translation. Next up, I want to address something called second-hand translations. This happens when someone that wants to translate a work doesn't know the original language, however knows a language in which the work has been translated into. So they use that translated version as a reference point. This is terrible, as not only do you lose the original meaning, you also lose the original text, because the author, or rather the translator, would have changed the meaning and the word formation and the phrasings in order to fit the new language. This is a terrible way of going about translating, and I would highly suggest that you stick away from this kind of translations. All told, picking a proper translation shouldn't be that hard now that you know exactly what to look out for. And I'll even provide you a small guide so as to understand how exactly you can pick the right translation and improve your experience when reading. The rule of thumb is reading the opera in the native language if possible. If not, then you should try to read it in a language that is similar to the one that it was written in. So, if you would have to, read a French book, or rather written by a French author, you should try to read it in a Romance language. If you are reading a German book, then you should try to read it in English, and so forth. If you don't know any languages that are correlated with the original language, you should try to read in the one that's the most similar. So for example, let's take a Russian piece of literature. You don't know any Slav languages, however you do know Romance language. Therefore you should read in the Romance language due to the fact that Russian was influenced by French in the 18th and 19th century. That means that the Slav language will better morph into the Romance language translation. Picking the wrong translation won't necessarily alter the story, however it will ruin your experience reading. Make sure to do your research on the translators and read other people's opinion on the translations and pick the right translation so that you do not ruin your experience when reading. If you like today's video, make sure to like and subscribe since I will post more of these kind of videos and I believe that they are very informative and will help you get better at reading. Have a good one.